Welcome, everyone, to Global Minnesota's Global Book Club. Wherever you are on the planet, we are glad you're with us today for our exciting discussion with the author of the Dissent Channel, American Diplomacy in a Dishonest Age. And I'll be introducing you to our guest, the author, Elizabeth Shackelford, in just a minute. My name is Mark Ritchie, and I serve as president of Global Minnesota. We're a nonprofit organization, 70 years old, that's been advancing international understanding and engagement for all of these years. And we think of ourselves as the way that Minnesotans get connected to the world and the world to Minnesota. These conversations, book clubs, other events are free to the public, and they're sponsored by the member support from folks like you that are there outside in the viewing audience today. Thank you to all of our members who are tuning in today. But if you're not a member yet, consider joining. It's an important organization with conversations that help make our world a better place for everybody, and members have some special benefits. But during this coming month, so October, our big focus is always on food security because we sponsor a global symposium on World Food Day. It's a partnership with other organizations like the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Program and others. This year, we're also having a special partnership in Minnesota with our good friends at Second Harvest Heartland and their initiative and their Minnesota Central Kitchen. If for every membership or donation made to Global Minnesota in October, we will both advance global understanding, our mission, and we're going to provide 2 prepared meals through Second Harvest Heartland Central Kitchen to those who are hungry or malnourished here in our own state, in our region. If you contribute $100 or more, it's a different membership level. It's beyond those 2 meals. You also get an eco-friendly Global Minnesota mini cutting board. So watch for those. You'll see all of that information on our website. I want to thank our program partners today, Majors and Quinns at one of the country's finest independent bookstores, and Landmark Center, our good friends over in downtown St. Paul. And a special welcome to all of you who are here today. Our guest is Elizabeth Shackelford. She's a senior fellow in the U.S. Foreign Policy with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. You'll have a chance to send your questions to Lizzie, as she is called, through an email address, questions with an S at globalminnesota.org. It's also right there in the box in the channel. And Lizzie had a very distinguished career in the U.S. State Department until December 2017 when she resigned. Her resignation letter was one of the first that drew attention to the declining state of diplomacy. And she knew what she was talking about, having served in Somalia, Kenya, South Sudan, the Horn of Africa is sometimes referred to, and the home of many, many citizens of Minnesota now, also served in Poland and Washington, D.C. In her book, The Dissent Channel, she looks at the issues that really surrounded her and all of the team there in the embassy in South Sudan. And she captures this in a very dramatic style of writing that really caught my attention, grabbed my heart. She's published a lot of things in newspapers around the country, and her experience in life of university and law school and all of that. I'd like to invite Elizabeth to join me on the screen and for us to have an opportunity to hear from her and have some questions to ask her. Thank you so much, Lizzie, for joining us here today from your position there at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's really great. I'm glad that we're able to do this event. I know we've been hoping to do it in person, and I do hope to make a visit there soon so I can see you in this group in person. I just want to start with a few minutes to kind of introduce a little bit more about my book for those who haven't had a chance to read it. As Mark has previewed already, the main narrative storyline of it is my firsthand account of what was happening with U.S. foreign policy on the ground in South Sudan in 2013 and 2014, which was in the lead up to South Sudan's civil war and in the months immediately following the outbreak. In this story, I use the example of U.S. foreign policy in South Sudan, really frontline activity on the ground to demonstrate the costs of having a foreign policy that's driven more by inertia and short-term political goals than principles and long-term strategies and interests. The core principle that we should have been abiding by in South Sudan in order to pursue our long-term interests there was accountability for injustice. And this story demonstrates how we repeatedly failed to do this on every front. But intertwined in this narrative is a condensed history of key aspects of US foreign policy. The book is intended to be easily accessible and interesting to a non-foreign policy audience, because a big part of this for me was to tell the story of the United States and South Sudan, but also share how this fits into and can explain a lot more about how our foreign policy history is and where it works and where it doesn't. And I want to bring this conversation to a wider public audience. So the book tells kind of three stories. It tells the South Sudan story, which is one that a lot of Americans know about, but they don't know fully about it. The role of the United States in helping South Sudan become an independent country was very significant, and it was given high praise for a long time. But at some point, the American government's position became really ineffectual. We continued to follow a steady course of supporting our chosen protagonist in this story, and even as the evidence began to mount that there really should have been a change in course, and that what we were supporting and propping up was really bad governance. The second part of the story, or the second story in the book, is the US foreign policy story. And I used South Sudan to talk about this example of how our day-to-day decisions on the front lines of diplomacy are really driven by a misguided foreign policy approach. As I mentioned, it's driven by inertia and short-term thinking and a short-term focus on security, which ultimately undermines those things in the long term. If you've been paying much attention to the Afghanistan situation, these are a lot of the same mistakes that we made there, just on a larger scale. And then the third story of this book is the story of a State Department culture, which is largely reflected in different parts of the federal government. It's a culture of go along to get along. Diplomats are peacemakers. They are trained to mitigate and solve problems and not to create them. But what this translates into is a culture that is really dismissive of dissent. The result of this is a really narrow conversation that provides few opportunities for critical self-reflection. Again, this is another thing that we saw in Afghanistan over and over again in the past 20 years. So in writing this book, I hope to help contribute to a broader effort to democratize our foreign policy, to really bring it closer to the American people. This is why I've chosen a reading style that is really storytelling and easily accessible. And this is because I really believe that if more Americans were more engaged in our foreign policy and had a voice in our foreign policy, that we would do our foreign policy better. I think that bringing more Americans into that story and helping them to be more critical of what we do will help make Congress more kind of engage more in the oversight role that it's supposed to play. So this is why I've written a book that's really targeting the public. And finally, the kind of final purpose in writing this book was to help draw attention to the importance of diplomacy. Diplomacy is a far less costly and risky tool in our foreign policy toolbox than things like military intervention. And yet today, many people in Washington and in the foreign policy establishment really conflate engagement with military engagement and give short shrift to the other ways that we can be involved in the world. So as I wrote this book, at the time of writing, diplomacy was seriously diminished under the last administration, which left a lot of positions unfilled and damaged a lot of our relationships with friends and allies. But none of the problems with our foreign policy were new then. They were just exacerbated by the last administration. And this is why it's going to take more than words and more than just electing a different administration to improve that and to bring America back to the international table. So I hope that you learn more about this book and this discussion, and I hope that you have an opportunity to check it out yourself. With that, Mark,
Lizzie, thank
I invite you
you
in.
so much for joining us today. And I know that you were careful in choosing that title, the Dissent Channel. Could you just give our viewer just a tiny picture of what that means inside the world of diplomacy, or your world in that case?
Absolutely. So if you read the book, the Dissent Channel itself comes in a little further along in it, but it's a big theme in the book because of the need of of pushing back on our status quo in order to improve our foreign policy. But the channel itself is this unique tool that the State Department created back in the Vietnam War era, because there was such a range of anxiety within the State Department about our policy in Vietnam. And there was a lot of pushback, there were a lot of resignations at the time, and the State Department wanted to create a tool that would help people, particularly kind of at the mid-levels who don't have a lot of influence over the decision-making process, to voice their concerns and raise their opinions and have them be heard. The Dissent Channel is this official mechanism by which anyone in the State Department can file a formal objection to our policies. It's not for, complaining about anything on the, human relations. It's not for HR issues. It's not for administrative issues. It's specifically for raising concerns about policy. After you have utilized all of the other means available, after you've worked through your ambassador, after you've tried to push things up the chain of command, if you still feel unsatisfied, you can send this cable, which cable's how State Department folk communicate. It's basically an email form that's formal, but that's what we call it. We call it a channel. So we send these cables through the Dissent Channel, and it's a requirement under our regulations that it goes to the Secretary of State's office, that it goes to several high-level offices, and that officer is required to have a formal response given to them. It doesn't really work the way it was intended, or perhaps it does. It doesn't really change policy, but it is a way to officially register complaints about policy.
Well, one of the things I know from reading the book is that your belief that policy needs to change, but it has to come from the sort of demand of people through the politics and through the political system, I think has been one of the themes that has resonated. Of course, Global Minnesota, our whole vision is about the public's involvement by being better informed and engaged and connection. Now, your current work at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, this is, of course, very important for us. Chicago is a big city. Chicago Council on Global Affairs is the largest, most important. But perhaps most important is that your assignment or your role is to help connect more of the Midwestern, the heartland of the nation's individuals and organizations that are working in diplomacy, in public policy. Can you give us a sense of how that connection came to be and then how that has been unfolded? Because it seems like you are walking your talk by this work that you've taken up since your resignation from state.
Absolutely. And you put it really well, Mark. It's so essential to have more public engagement on foreign policy in order to ensure that it's accountable and that it works for the American people. But the position that I have at the Chicago Council, it is unique because I am specifically tasked with doing outreach and engagement within the Midwest, which is to me incredibly important. And we don't have enough things focused on this. As you suggested, after I resigned, I spent a lot of time doing this outreach on my own, just offering to speak to different student groups and organizations across the country, publishing things to the extent that I could in outlets that I thought would reach normal American people, not just Foreign Policy magazine. But I was doing that just sheerly out of interest. It's remarkable to me that I've now been given a full-time position where I get paid to do this. I couldn't be happier because it's where my heart really is. But the Chicago Council, the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, the Foreign Policy Association, the World Affairs Councils, and Global Minnesota, so many of these organizations that have these roles to do to do some form of outreach of American awareness of foreign policy were really launched about 100 years ago. I mean, you said Global Minnesota, 70 years, but this kind of initial trend started right after World War I, when there was this pushback against American engagement in the world, this kind of isolationist interest, about 100 years ago. And that's where the Chicago Council was kind of first born. And it was born by people who wanted to push back against a narrative that, that America should, come back home and not be engaged in the world. So I think it's been 100 years of back and forth. Sometimes there's been more focus on, yes, we want Americans involved, but there's always been this tug in the foreign policy professional world that keeps foreign policy in an elite space, that has this sense of, well, we know best, and what's best for America is best for Americans, and Americans don't really understand foreign policy. So groups like Global Minnesota and the Chicago Council push back against that And but this is a formal opportunity where the Chicago Council has been able to say, we really want to put some effort into this regional outreach because the Midwest is such an important part of the country and really should have more of a say and more influence in our foreign policy.
Yes, of course, we're always aware of kind of the coastal aspect of how other countries think about the U.S. and they may or may not like that. But also in general, I would say national political figures just make some assumptions, fly over land, or they might give some kind of nod or wave. But what, of course, we know is the central position of so many people in shaping our nation and the foreign policy, from, Frank Kellogg from Minnesota, who got a Nobel Peace Prize for the treaty, the Kellogg-Briand Treaty, all the way to, presidents, Truman and others who are all from the region, and President Hoover and others who had big understanding of the necessity of engaging in the world, whether that was in a humanitarian way or direct. But I feel like this is an opportunity right now because this big examination that's happening around Afghanistan permits two things, discernment, looking into it. But then what do we do? And Lizzie, I feel like you're going to be one of the people with an overview, a 30,000-foot picture of what's happening in the Midwest. How do you see this sudden experience, this sudden foreign policy incident, this foreign policy, event that's happening, guiding and shaping how we as a region, a Midwest heartland region, is perceived and how we engage going forward in a more publicly engaged? How do we put diplomacy first?
It's such an interesting time to be talking about this issue because the Biden administration has, as you well know, Mark, they're experimenting with this idea, with this approach of foreign policy for the middle class. It's this lens through which ever since the campaign of President Biden and ever shortly after he appointed Secretary Blinken to be the Secretary of the State Department, they've staffed the administration's foreign policy positions with a lot of people who were involved in an assessment over the last couple of years of how does foreign policy impact the middle class. Now, I'll say middle class is shorthand for Americans, for kind of normal average Americans, because most Americans identify as the middle class. There's statistics on this I should have at my fingertips, but I don't. But the idea is, how does our foreign policy affect Americans, American families, American workers, American businesses in their lives every day? I don't think the administration has quite figured out how to do it yet, or exactly how that works, but it's been interesting to watch them try and learn. We've been at the Chicago Council, we've been talking a lot with the State Department, and we know that they're working on different ways to do outreach to specifically the Midwest, because they see Midwestern communities as being a really good example of how things impact American communities when you get outside the Washington, D.C. Beltway and the coastal cities and communities. So I think that right now is the best opportunity we've had in decades to use communication and outreach from the Midwest to help inform and shape American foreign policy. And Afghanistan is a great example. You heard President Biden over and over and over again, mention how the war in Afghanistan is costing Americans a lot of money and is not doing anything to make Americans secure. And that was really at the top of why he decided to go forward with the withdrawal. And even though the withdrawal itself happened horribly, it was not well done. It was never going to be pretty. But American public opinion remains very, very supportive of the withdrawal itself. So that's an early example in this administration of how they're really trying to follow through with, ensuring that what we continue works for Americans. And that pushes back against inertia. And Mark, inertia is one of the biggest challenges in our foreign policy. It's one of the reasons the last three presidents continued the war in Afghanistan. It was just easier to do it than it was to end it. But that wasn't serving your average American family or business. And so I think that that's really just kind of an example of how they're using this lens to look through it. But we have to seize on this opportunity and make sure that congressional representatives hear from their populations about what they're doing, that as the State Department does some outreach to different areas, that, citizens participate, that they, find ways to communicate to our government that they do care about what we're doing, that they do care about bringing in Afghan refugees, for example, that they understand how those types of decisions help Americans, and that other decisions, don't do much for us, and we should really think about what we're doing.
Well, one of the things about your book, and I want to highly recommend it to anyone watching who hasn't had a chance or hasn't finished it yet, because you do tell a complete story, and it it ends with some drama. I'll talk about that maybe at the end of our hour. But the thing I was really appreciative of your book is that it provided a picture of a body of people working on behalf of our nation, whose devotion to human rights and democracy and protection of the planet and protection of women and girls and everybody was genuine, sincere, passionate. But the mechanisms by which their work was supervised or guided, or policies, basically undermined it. And your decision, ultimately, that resignation, had to do with not feeling like the people around you didn't share those values, but feeling like your experience was not giving you the opportunity to make a difference. And if I'm reading that correctly, it would seem like the emphasis needs to be on tapping the better angels, tapping the human rights initiative and imperatives and values, and figuring out the most effective ways to put those into motion alongside of the administrative capacity and things. So you have taken up one task, which is connecting people in the Midwest who are thinking about these issues and are wanting to put democracy first. Are you seeing resonance, or is the rest of the country noticing and paying attention, or we still need more amplification, more loudspeaker systems pointed east and west?
I do think that we need more amplification, but every conversation I have, and even as I have a biweekly column in the Chicago Tribune, I get letters from people saying, yeah, I agree with this. I understand diplomacy is important. We need to have policies that work for the American people. People are interested, engaged. I don't think a lot of Americans understand that their opinion and position is really valued. And I kind of liken it to, if you look back to the election, the kind of pre-election process last year, there was a massive ground game to get out the vote, right? You can't just do it at a high level. You had volunteers all across the country and communities across the country who are going out and knocking doors and making sure that people registered to vote and that they knew how to, and that they weren't discouraged by the pandemic and things like that. So that was just a pure democracy promotion, get out the vote. But it required a massive army of people to do it. And I think to really build an interest in foreign policy and an engagement in foreign policy that's sufficient enough to really sway and help us build better foreign policy, I think that you need that same kind of level of ground game. And that's where groups like Global Minnesota come in hand, and the World Affairs Councils across the country. And you look also at like university programs. But so one of the things I've been trying to do is to help connect with groups that are of kind of people who are already engaged, people who have shown their interest by participating in programs like Global Minnesota offers, and encouraging folks like that to talk to their friends and neighbors about it, to write letters to their congressmen when there are foreign policy issues that they care about. Because I just think it's going to take everybody who's already interested across the country to all kind of extend their web a little bit further, because it's going to take a lot of people. Now, I've been really reassured by the conversations I've had, because it does seem to resonate with every community I've had conversations with. But I just think it's going to take a lot of us to really make sure that the government that we have now follows through with this idea of thinking through with every foreign policy decision, how does this affect Americans? And getting involved in education. Ultimately, what I would love to see is that the State Department have offices more than they have now. They have diplomats and residents here and there, but I'd love to see the State Department have offices in every governor's office, to have somebody there who can help draw those connections and bring foreign policy closer to the American people. Until we have enough funding for that, we always need more funding at the State Department. It's gonna fall on people like us.
I know that the State Department has, over the years, placed people in, for example, congressional offices and other places. In fact, it was a State Department person who ultimately made it possible for Minnesota to actually bid and now hopefully host a World Expo. This was, I think he might even now be in Chiang Mai as our Consul General. But in any case, that idea that you were expressing also would put those State Department individuals in touch with a whole other group of society. And so it's the sort of two-way street that you wrote about in your book. And I believe that that part of your story, that you had been very active in civil society and NGO and other organizations before you went to the State Department. Can you tell us a little bit more about your path in that way?
Sure. I've bounced around in just about every possible way you can be involved in foreign affairs in my career, which I think helps give me a bit of an overview. But I've started out very early on working for a non-governmental organization in South Africa right after college. And shortly after that, I was working in Parliament at the time, in the South African Parliament, which was this fascinating experience for a 22-year-old to have. I got to kind of see how this young government, just a few years post-apartheid, was starting to kind of put the pieces together and figure out how to go from being, kind of effectively guerrilla fighters to being, representatives of their communities in Parliament. It was a very interesting opportunity. And then a few years later, I ended up going to law school after that, worked as a lawyer, and then I also worked as a government contractor, as a USAID contractor on USAID programs. So I got to see the business kind of legal and regulatory environment development side. So traveling around to different countries all around the world and doing assessments of where their laws and regulatory programs needed to be improved to help business. So these are two very different areas. But one of the things that they showed me is that so much of what we try to do and promote around the world connects so much to what kind of economic development organizations and social services organizations do at a local and state level here in the United States, because communities all need a lot of the same things. So you were talking earlier today about the issue of kind of world hunger and issues like that, which are global problems. And they are also local problems, right? Dealing with food security is a local and a global problem. So having that perspective is really important. And for me, being able to see how we try to promote, how we, kind of the Americans or kind of Western development states and organizations, try to help promote more stable and prosperous communities across the globe, are lessons that we often have to apply here at home as well. So that's where I also think, as you said, having kind of almost ad hoc small numbers of diplomats in residence, or the occasional kind of position of a State Department personnel in congressional offices, is always very helpful. But what would be even more helpful is if we really instituted this in all the states across the country, and then you have that learning. Well, we see what they do in this state to address this problem, and we're working on this problem in Uganda as well. But like, how can you share those lessons? It would help to be a little bit more humble about what we can learn from ourselves and other places.
I was part of a conference on trade, a couple of years ago out here on trade with Africa, and one of the people who came out, and it was a really fabulous representation from trade and commerce. But anyhow, he kind of referenced, kind of in a throwaway comment, about a book called Outsmarting Apartheid, which detailed the internal activities of the US diplomats, consuls, and the consulates and the embassy in South Africa to be a huge part of the anti-apartheid movement. And I said, what? There's a book that describes it? So this whole, and he didn't notice that others of us perked up, those of us who had been active in that movement. But once I got the book, then I realized, oh, this would be really important as an instruction about how diplomats and their teams are parts of these global movements. Now we have global movements on climate, on health inequities, on domestic, but I'm guessing that your experience in South Africa had some warm and fuzzy aspects because some of those guerrilla fighters, then legislators, knew of those ways that diplomats before you helped to outsmart apartheid.
Yeah, we had such an interest, like the United States had a very complex relationship with South Africa during those years. We were a little late to the game with a lot of the kind of economic sanctions for, business reasons, but we were, the United States government was very active in other ways behind the scenes, as you said. And this gets back to, how do we make the case for diplomacy? Why isn't that book a movie? Why don't we have more pop culture that discusses and shows and gives these stories life, so that people can learn more about them? And I can attest, and you read the book, I mean, diplomacy is pretty exciting, and they're really compelling stories to tell. But I tell you, this gets back to the State Department doesn't make its case for these things. And a huge part of that is cultural. The military and the CIA have offices in Hollywood. They actively invest in promoting a positive image of their organizations. And it plays very well. I mean, there are reasons that there are really positive images of these other parts of the government and not of the State Department. But I love that you mentioned that book and that story, because it's, those are the stories we need to get out so that people understand that diplomacy, and behind the scenes can really play an important role.
Right. And I think if leaders of other movements, which are global, and now you name a movement, it's got to be global, would benefit from knowing these other tactics, these other approaches. I mean, for me, it was like a guidebook, like a Boy Scouts handbook for these activities. But I've been struck by your comments about needing to have other kind of stories. Yes, like that would be an exciting movie. Robert Kaplan writes some pretty wild books about foreign policy. Some of our viewers will be familiar with, Coming Anarchy and all that. But this last book of his about the Good American, about, was it George Gersony, America's greatest humanitarian? But anyhow, it's a story about somebody who within the system of the State Department and AID and others, step by step, touched lives of people and said the truth and backed it up with facts and with his own conversation. But I'm remembering that particular thing, what Robert was trying to say is that it was one very, very important person, but that person was supported by others, maybe who couldn't be quite as front or as engaging. But is that like your idea of some of the ways that we could take, Robert Kaplan's a big time writer, get more people to tell more good stories like that one?
If I could do one thing to change the weight that diplomacy is given in our foreign policy and in our country, it would be to find a really, really rich person to fund several very exciting movies about some of the most exciting diplomatic things. Unfortunately, I haven't found that yet, but I think it would be great. I mean, I think I loved writing my book. It's so wonderful to have that story out in the world, but only so many people read books. And I think that you could reach a lot more people more quickly with something that is more visual and more immediate. So I think that that's a great thing people could do if they had the means and had the interest and actually thought that they wanted to do something to really promote leaning more on diplomacy, using this tool as a tool of first resort. And I think one of the reasons that we have I've said this, that we have such public support for military engagement and intervention is because Hollywood makes it look very sexy and interesting. And, unfortunately, the State Department has not found a way to overcome that yet and make us look like we should be the first line of defense.
Well, so one of the things that we are discovering with Zoom and this virtual moment is that it's possible to maybe jump over some barriers and invite State Department people and to not be shy, and one of the things that I've discovered is that with the current moment and this, nobody's traveling and that sort of thing, individuals, churches could be inviting in to speak, Rotary groups, Lions clubs, policy related courses. I mean, there's there's almost no end to the process where you could write a short email to somebody if you knew the right name and address. They could say yes or no, and they could connect by Zoom, and they could spend an hour or 30 minutes or even 10. But it seems like we're in a moment when your vision of more interaction and more direct connection could take place if we just said, let's make it happen. Does that seem right?
I mean, I think we are at that moment. It's hard to get that moment to go viral, if you will. I'll say here, for anybody watching today, if you have a Lions Club or a Rotary Club or any group like that, I am always available to talk. I want to go reach out to more people myself. The challenge is getting people in the government. And I say this because you can get, right now, you're right, you can get kind of more ambassadors and high level people if you can corner their time to join something by Zoom. But one of the things I've been talking a lot about with some colleagues and former colleagues in the State Department is how do we make it more accessible for people who are, I like to call us the worker bees, the mid-level folks who are on the ground doing a lot of the work, who can really talk about what it's like to be working with Afghans who have worked with the United States and helping them to get out, to talk to people who are working on the front lines of some of what we're doing, let's say in Eastern Europe or in China, for example. The problem is the State Department is a very old-fashioned system, and they're working to get caught up with the social media world and the Zoom world and that type of thing. And it's still quite laborious for people who are kind of mid-ranking or even kind of early upper ranking to get permission to speak publicly. Particularly here back in the United States, there were old anti-propaganda laws against the State Department basically using propaganda on the American people. Now, most of that law has already been repealed, but there's still this cultural sense that we're not supposed to be promoting America to Americans or foreign policy to Americans. And that's just an obstacle. But the good news is there are a lot of conversations happening at the State Department now about how they can overcome this, change the culture, and get more foreign service officers and civil servants just to engage even in their hometowns, for example, which would be a really low cost way of helping to share the story of what we're doing.
Well, one of the things about your story about the Chicago Council was that period 100 years ago, roughly 100, with so many sort of public policy debates were about isolationism versus engagement, and about anti-immigrant, really racist, but other anti-immigrant activities versus recognition of who we are as a nation. So now, 100 years later, we have still some of the same debates and still some of the same issues. But I'm aware, at least in some places, Minnesota, which I happen to know better than others, the current moment is a moment when many people are kind of watching to see what's going to happen with the new arrivals from Afghanistan. Of course, Minnesota is #1 in refugees per capita, and we're a welcoming place, and it's made us strong and made us vibrant. But right at this moment, American businesses, hospitality through any other sector, from the airlines to manufacturing to schools and hospitals, are desperate for people, talent, and for devoted professionals and semi-skilled, you name it, across the board. And I know that at this time, that is a much different place to have a discussion about immigration and all of that, when the society is in very deep need of, than in times when you have, like, let's say, the late 20s to 30s of depression, where you have high unemployment and you have violent anti-immigrant and really a different kind of sense in the society. So do you think we can take advantage of this moment where there is so much awareness of the need for the skills and the energy and creativity, and use it to engage that bigger discussion that you're describing?
I think we have to take advantage of this moment. And you're absolutely right, Mark. I mean, right now, with the need for workers in so many industries, it's a perfect time to be raising awareness of this option, which we've had, which has served this country very well over time, which is immigration and refugees. And interestingly, even with as dramatic as the debate at the national level is over immigration and over particularly the refugees out of Afghanistan, public opinion is still very, very supportive, not only of bringing people in. There's concern around immigration and exactly how to do immigration reform, but in terms of bringing in Afghan refugees in particular, public opinion on both sides of the aisle is very high. We actually had a Chicago Council survey that's going to be released, I believe, this week, and they have some numbers on that specifically. It's extremely high support for bringing in Afghan refugees, particularly those who supported the U.S. So I think that there is a positive relationship, in most Americans' minds with that, regardless of kind of all of the noise that you hear, kind of on network news. But I think in terms of connecting it to the larger picture of how foreign policy can be used to help make America stronger and American communities stronger, I think you're absolutely right. It's a great time to be talking about it and to be ensuring that we draw that connection.
So in the course of your career, you were in many places, but many of them were in East Africa, or what we might call the Horn of Africa. In Minnesota, we have a very large, very vibrant, very successful East African diaspora community, Ethiopia, Somalia, et cetera. There seems like there's a special way that large and successful diaspora communities can be part and parcel of this bigger conversation if we engage it. Are you seeing some examples of success stories of partnering between the world that's within us and the world that's around us in this larger discussion about foreign policy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you have some really great examples out of Minnesota in particular with the Somali immigrant community and how involved they've gotten in so much government. I mean, including representation at the national level. And those are people who can help really push that conversation to the fore, not only at the national level where we do need to be having it, but also at the local level to just demonstrate how much this is helping. I think it's great to have business leaders who are immigrants who can show how they've improved the communities that they're in and how additional members of diaspora have done the same. And you see this with all of these diaspora communities. They do tend to congregate in different places. One person arrives with their family, they find a good job or industry or business that they can get involved in, and they continue to bring other people over. In Minnesota, you have Somalis, you have South Sudanese, and when I worked in Nigeria before, which I did briefly as well, it was everybody there went to Texas. So their big diaspora community was all in the Dallas area, which it's interesting to see how different groups land. And of course, my first, and it's true regardless of what types of countries you're talking about. When my first tour was in Poland, where I did consular work, and everybody from there was, of course, going to Chicago or one of 2 or 3 other cities. And you see how these diaspora communities come in, and over a generation, 2 and more, they establish themselves and create. They are the best advocates that we have for increasing refugee acceptance and for better managing our immigration programs. And I think that to the extent that we have groups that can help highlight that, because sometimes there are communities that will take that message from other communities, but not from the diaspora community themselves. So I think that's where it's really important for people to help elevate those voices and help share those stories. You might have people who are not as receptive to hearing about the successes of the Somali American community from the Somali American community. But if they hear about it from friends and neighbors or other church or in other organizations, it helps reinforce what that does for our communities and how much that helps strengthen.
So this is a really important point that you're making, which is that in general, societies have been divided. I mean, Chicago Council was created because somebody created America first, and but in that context, the voices which speak up should be from the whole community, the whole society, because they'll be, simply questioning, is that a person's self-interest? But I think that in a state like Minnesota, where all of our diasporas, then they start out with Norwegians and Germans and Scandinavians, and then, Czechs and Russian Jews, and you name it, we have big diaspora communities who've stayed in close historic and heritage contact and really been the focus of building the community and really strong voices for the next generation and the next generation. And I think that kind of intergenerational and intra-diaspora support is an element of what could be promoted as a kind of conscious. I mean, I think what Global Minnesota is one of the things that we're most proud of, is trying to make sure that we are finding those intersection points. Now, I'm wondering if some of these big global topics, climate, pandemics, refugees and displacement, if these issues, which we now know, the whole world is affected, do they give us some cross-sector ammunition or vitamins to build out that broader conversation that you were mentioning and that your book expresses so much hope in?
Absolutely. I feel very strongly that today, more than ever before, it is impossible to ignore how interconnected things are and how our national security issues are not what we used to traditionally think of, threats from other states or other states' militaries. They are all things that all countries have to work on together. They are climate change. They are global pandemics. They are even our supply chains are incredibly intertwined at this point. And so these are ways where I wish we had gotten to this sooner, because issues such as climate change, we should have been addressing better for the last couple of decades. But we're here today. You look at the weather patterns over the past year alone, and it's just become impossible for even the people who might prefer to be more isolationist to realize that they too have to rely on people around the world. So I think that is a great entryway to this discussion. And you mentioned, refugee flows and that type of issue. These are things that create great instability around the world. So instead of having great instability coming from refugees fleeing war, and if you look at an example talking about the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia is a place where we're starting to see the same problem. Instead of letting that challenge be something that gets out of hand and creates instability that could affect any number of things that do challenge us here at home, we can look at that as an opportunity to, better manage immigration and refugee assistance in order to turn, we might not be able to solve that war, but we can find ways to ensure that it is more, that is better managed for us here at home, and that we can, let's say, provide a home for people who are fleeing, and they can help our communities in turn as well.
Well, I've had the great privilege of working with lots of different wings of the State Department, both in my current position at Global Minnesota, but also in some of the work around the idea of bringing a World Expo. And one of the things that I learned from the State Department historians was how much the history of world fairs or world expos started with a kind of like, isn't there some way to stop England and France from fighting wars every 5 years and every 10 years? Like, can't we do something else than fight wars? And so there was a consciousness about bringing people together. And of course, the original Olympics were about trying to stop the warring between the city-states. So we've often been thinking about putting diplomacy first, or putting other forms of competition, or looking for these. And right at this moment, there's a giant expo, a World's Fair in Dubai, and all of the information, the speeches, all of it are real articulate visions of a world coming together, because we have so many big problems and we need to focus on those problems, not create more or fight. And so the theme of that Dubai Expo, connecting minds, creating the future, it seems like those are the kinds of messaging and the kinds of ideas that would give us some energy and juice, with voices like yours calling us to this task. When you were finishing the editing of your book, I don't know exactly all the editing, but I was really, really taken by your closing, I want to ask you about it, but let me share it with our viewers. South Sudan, about your story, provides a roadmap of what happens when we lose sight of that. And that was the special nature of our values, the special nature of our focus on making the world a better place. Now that I've told this story, thank you, ma'am, will people listen? And I've got to restart my little machine to bring this back. Is change possible? Question mark. Can we live up to our potential and in doing so, help shape a safer, more prosperous world? Question mark. I don't know yet, but I'm willing to try, period. How is it going? Are you still in that mode? We don't know, but you're willing to try.
I'm definitely still trying. And I'm more optimistic now than when I wrote those words, because I feel like, with as horrible as so much of what the world's been through in the past 2 years, I think it really has made it abundantly clear how essential it is for us to work together, and for us to address things through non-military tools, for us to address things through, working together, diplomacy, trade, making these things work better, not just for the most wealthy, not just for America, but for everyone, and how intertwined that is. So I think we're at an inflection point. I'm not sure which direction we're going to go, but Americans are certainly aware now that a medical issue in China, in a town that nobody, in a city that nobody had ever heard of, has dramatically changed and upended everyone's lives here. And how might that have gone differently? What might have gone differently if there was more free press in China, for example? If we had a better relationship through a more functional World Health Organization, if we had better medical partnerships with some of the other countries where it came first, and what might have been different for just this singular pandemic. And you elevate that to a much bigger level when you talk about things like climate change. But I think there's a greater awareness now than there was 2 years ago that that we have to work together, and that foreign affairs and foreign policy affects Americans in their everyday lives. So I am hopeful, and I'm continuing to try.
Well, that's good news. It's for me, your life of service in humanitarian organizations and in organizations looking at legal, you have given in a way to public service throughout your career, and now you're continuing that in so many different ways. But you're also now part of an organization, a very large and prestigious and very effective organization that's connecting up with others around the world, around the country. So it's also your work that gives me the kind of optimism, the kind of opportunity, the kind of hope about the future. I look forward to your coming to Minnesota at some point and a public discussion. And again, I'll probably ask you a similar question, but I'm loving the fact that you're more optimistic now, but also you're really specific with some ideas about what we can be doing and how we can be doing that. So I want to thank you again for joining us here now. And I want to thank all of our viewers for being part of this today. Majors and Quinn, incredible independent bookstore. You can get her book there. And I think you could find Outsmarting Apartheid if you're looking for it, and A Good American if you're looking for it. But I also want to thank all of the individuals who've supported our work at Global Minnesota that make these kind of events possible. There is an archive of past and this one today of all of our different programs. You can find that on our Global Minnesota channel on YouTube. This program will be up on that archive very soon. We want to make sure that we have it available as soon as possible. And I want to remind folks, World Food Day coming right up, October 15th. We'll have a day of different presentations, but we're looking at that intersection of how climate is impacting food security, how the COVID pandemic is affected, and how violent conflict, which Lizzie, you kept bringing us back to, like, this whole business of violence is the root of many different problems and many different, components of the grief that humans feel and also that our planet is suffering. And so trying to see the interconnection between food and food security and insecurity with these other mega issues is one of the places where we can practice that learning from each other. And then the food movement's a big movement. The climate movement's a big movement. The movement for peace is a big movement. Can these movements help bring forth that foreign policy where diplomacy is first and where understanding leads to the kind of opportunity that I think you hoped for when you were in the Foreign Service? And at one point you said, no, it's not happening for me, but now you've devoted your life to helping to bring that into reality. So Lizzie, I want to thank you again. I want to give you your opportunity for your last words until you come visit us in the near future, we hope.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. This was really a pleasure. And I will just reiterate to everyone who's joined here today that it is up to all of us to continue making the case, to our friends and neighbors to pay attention to ensure that American foreign policy is a force for good in the world and for our communities here at home. Everybody has a role in doing that. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Lizzie. And thank you again to all of our viewers. Good day.